Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series about fixing democracy, I'm talking to Claudia Chwalisz, founder and chief executive of Democracy Next, about her organisation's specialism, citizens' assemblies. It's an idea that often seems to be just about to come into fashion without ever quite happening. Is its time now? Claudia, the idea of citizens' assemblies, I think to a lot of people it sounds like a very modern idea, something quite technical, a device for addressing issues with our democracy. And it tends to come out of I don't want to caricature it here, but a sort of think tank world. It's often suggested in quite specific contexts. And yet at the same time, I think it's fair to say it has deep roots in the core idea of democracy itself. Citizens getting together to participate and to think through for themselves about the most important questions. So if we could start with the history, in your view, how does it tap into older ideas of democracy, the idea of the citizen assembly? What is it drawing on from the deep backstory of democratic politics?
I think that's a really good starting point because I think a lot of people tend to think of democracy as elections today, and there's a bit of that shorthand. So an idea like citizens' assemblies therefore feels quite new and innovative, but actually it has really deep historical roots. And the way that I think about citizens' assemblies is actually being something that revives some of this ancient democratic DNA that we have, but with a modern approach. So back in ancient Athens, again, also quite often a reference point for thinking about the roots of democracy. I think many people don't realize that of most government positions, there were around 6,000 of them. Almost all of those, except about 10, were filled by this practice of sortition, meaning randomly selecting decision makers, which is also one of these core ideas that's modernized in the approach of citizens' assemblies today. And so in the ancient Athenian democratic processes, there was the main council of 500, which in ancient Greek was called the boule. And within that, everyone was selected by sortition to serve on a one-year term, and they would prepare the agenda for another body that was more, I would say, like a direct democratic participation body called the Assembly. And so the citizens' assemblies of today are really drawing on what were considered for a very long time in democratic theory and practice as a very democratic way of doing things. The Athenians themselves actually saw elections as an aristocratic or elitist form of choosing officials, that they favored the wealthy, the eloquent, those who were well connected, and even etymologically, the roots of election are related to elite. And so random selection, sortition, was considered a more democratic and egalitarian form of doing things.
I'm not sure about the most eloquent, but well-connected and wealthy, they weren't wrong about that. But in that core idea of the gathering of the citizens, it's like there are two things going on here. And I think both of these are really important in Citizens' Assembly, but I'm never quite sure which is the one that carries the most weight. So as you say, one is randomness, the idea that any citizen, simply by being a citizen, is qualified for the role. We can't have everyone taking part in everything, but we can select on a basis that it doesn't really matter which subset of the population we've chosen, because all of the citizens are equally qualified. And then the second idea is the idea of a large enough number of people debating, discussing, coming to a decision about the issue that you get a better outcome than you might get otherwise. And that is often couched under the heading of deliberation. But it also has some connection to other democratic theories which are to do with number or the quantity of people involved in a decision. So if we separate those two things out, which one do you think is the more important here? So first of all, the sortition, the randomness, the idea that you could have a decision-making body. It could be a parliament, right? People sometimes in the British context say the House of Lords should be selected by sortition. Let's just pick 500 people at random from the population to be the second chamber. How much of the Citizens' Assembly idea is powered by the notion of randomness or sortition?
Well, so randomness or sortition, I think, is maybe one of the aspects that's the most distinct to other components that are found also in other parts of our democracies, but it's not the only thing that defines citizens' assemblies either. And you rightly point to one other, which is deliberation. I would also say that the concept of rotation is also really important for citizens' assemblies. The idea that people rotate in that privilege and responsibility of representing others because of the fact that you have the randomness and the lottery process that goes on an ongoing basis. But the deliberation also matters. Yeah.
So in that ancient Athenian case, it's easy to miss it, but 1 year, that's a rotation principle. It sounds like a long time, but actually relative to what we see in contemporary politics and contemporary democracy. And it was the idea of the 1 year parliament was a central plank of Chartism, for instance, in the 19th century. The three things that they wanted were a secret ballot, universal suffrage, but also parliaments that rotated often enough that power couldn't become entrenched. So that's there in the ancient Athenian idea too. But I think in citizen assemblies, the rotation is quicker, right? That's, we're not asking people to sit for a year.
Yeah, it's quicker. And it makes me think that actually I didn't also mention that in the ancient Athenian system, there wasn't just the council that I referred to, but they also had jury selection. And this was on a much more frequent basis, that actually on a daily basis, there were larger numbers, usually somewhere between 200 to 1,500 citizens that were selected by lottery. And they had even created this ingenious technology of a machine called the Clarotarian that selected people on a daily basis. So we've taken that concept actually in our modern day criminal juries, which again I think people have normalized and not really questioned in a way that sometimes comes up more in some of the discussions about citizens' assemblies. But we do see this practice already for quite a long time in the criminal justice system too. And about deliberation as well. So, I mean, I guess this draws on a few different other strands of democratic theory and practice too. I think Condorcet's jury theorem, for instance. So for people listening who might not be familiar with this, the core idea of this being really that, for example, if you would imagine having a really difficult question and you would have two options, either you ask one expert or you ask 100 randomly selected people and go with the majority of what they say. Condorcet's jury theorem showed that if each person is even slightly more likely to be right than wrong, even if that's a 51% chance, then that larger group will almost always outperform the expert. And so basically when you get to a point of with 100 people, it's over 99% certain to be the better answer than that of the expert. And so it's a bit of this mathematical principle behind an idea that we sometimes hear about, kind of like the wisdom of the crowds. It's not some magical concept. There's a mathematical theorem behind this. And even though that dates from 1785, there's also contemporary political scientists and theorists who've been doing work around similar lines, but also in the worlds of business and psychology, there's also been a lot done on this, a lot of research which shows us that more diverse, heterogeneous groups of people tend to come up with better decisions than experts. So we sometimes call this collective intelligence as a notion, and it's embodied in citizens' assemblies by creating the time and space for people to be able to deliberate, meaning also to weigh evidence collectively, to discuss it with one another, provide the best arguments and reasoning, listen to each other's perspectives, and then do the hard work of finding common ground on what do they agree on. I would say it's maybe even a step further than the theory in the sense that they're not just an aggregation of the views, but actually people are working to find consensus on what do they agree on as well.
We're going to talk in a moment about how it does work in practice in the contemporary setting. But what you just described with those two jury ideas, and you touched on it at the end, you could argue they're very, very different conceptions. The Condorcet conception and what we think of as a jury, say, in the criminal justice system, in jury-based systems. And that's because in that larger model, it often assumes an absence of deliberation. So earlier in a very different series for this podcast about political trials, I talked about the trial of Socrates. The trial of Socrates, which took place before a classic ancient Athenian jury of 500 people. And from what we know of that trial, it was not at all deliberative. There's no way that 500 people can discuss it. Actually, it was more like sort of rabble-rousing. It was trying to persuade them. So that's not a sort of Condorcet idea. But the aggregation of their views, and from what we know of the Socrates trial, it ended up 280-220 to condemn Socrates. So on the balance, Condorcet would say if these people were genuinely listening and not being swayed one way or the other by some kind of collective prejudice, that was the correct outcome, but it was in the absence of deliberation. And I think one of the challenges of citizens' assemblies, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, is to get that balance between, on the one hand, scale, so that we can build in collective intelligence, but that is aggregative. And on the other hand, something that, when it works well, we often think of as working with a jury of, say, 12 people who hear the evidence and then are given a room and they can sit in it and they can talk it through. More than 12 starts to feel unwieldy. And there is a challenge, isn't there, with citizens' assemblies? These two ideas possibly pulling in different directions. The Condorcet jury theorem, on some accounts, justifies referendums. It's like, well, if 100 is good, what about 10 million? And that's not the citizens' assembly idea. So is that part of the real challenge of a citizens' assembly, that to draw on the two jury traditions and somehow find that magic space between them?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it, because I think citizens' assemblies in some ways are similar, but also quite different to juries, both in terms of the size that you were talking about. And I think there's been a big debate actually in the field about optimal size, because you definitely get trade-offs that the larger the size of the group, the more, well, unwieldy, as you say, but the more you also end up resorting to aggregative measures of voting to actually get to a sense of what is the consensus of the group, rather than being able to actually have one conversation with 12 people around the table as in a jury. But at the same time, you do want to have a larger number of people in terms of the collective intelligence benefits, but also, I think, perceptions of legitimacy when this is being used to inform either legislation or policy making, or changes on constitutional measures, as we have seen in some places. So citizens' assemblies have tended to be rather somewhere between 30 to 50 people on a local level, upwards to 150 to 200 on a national scale, addressing bigger issues. And while criminal juries also tend to last typically condensed in a few days, citizens' assemblies are also deliberating for a much longer period of time, usually numerous days spread out over weeks and months. Some of the examples actually have 25 days of deliberation or around there. So there's a space opened up for people to really go into the complexity of an issue. And also, I guess, criminal juries are in this yes-no verdict sort of mindset, the same way as a referendum would be. Whereas in a citizens' assembly, it's not about a yes or no issue. It's about a complex topic that doesn't have just a simple yes or no answer. And the point is also trying to, I suppose, weigh some of the values-driven aspects of a decision with the technical, scientific evidence that's behind it. And I think that's where, on a lot of policy-related questions or constitutional issues or other things, these are not just also decisions that lend themselves to those yes-no kind of dilemmas. Like they're not just technical issues either. You need to have a wider public sense of what are the values that are behind this. What kind of society do we want to be living in?
In your experience, is there an upper limit? So when you said you could go to 150, 200. In the back of my mind, 150 is a magic number because there is a view that's the maximum number of meaningful human relationships that a single human being can have, in which they can. So when someone has 500 friends on Facebook or the equivalent, we know a lot of those are bogus relationships because it's thought to be around 150 is the upper limit. Dunbar's number. And that's because it's thought that human beings are not really capable beyond that of meaningfully distinguishing between the people with whom they are engaging. Is that true in a citizens' assembly as well, in the sense that you would hope in the ideal version that over this time, the people would get to know each other? So at 12 in a jury, you can end up lifelong friends, enemies, whatever, after a few days of deliberation. 30, 50, I can see it. When it gets above 100, close to 150, does that get much harder in your experience?
Yeah, I think so. And I think even if you were just to put yourself in the test of thinking, if you were in a room with 150 people, how would you feel in that space? And can you really genuinely have a conversation that involves everybody at the same time? Can you actually know who everyone is and so on? So if you're deliberating for the course of 9 months with 150 people, you do get to know everyone at some point or another. And I also think one of the most interesting parts of the research around citizens' assemblies is about this idea of the importance of group building, is what it gets called in the literature. But it really relates to this phase that tends to happen at the very start of a citizens' assembly process when people have more informal moments, they build trust, they get to know one another, they have coffee, they maybe have their dinner or pints at the pub together. And this process of building trust is actually the most important factor related to people's ability to then handle complexity in a deliberative assembly process as well. So I think that aspect of how do you create the conditions for people to actually be able to trust one another, to work together constructively, to get to a point of being able to reach consensus as a group, and this not just being a process where you've aggregated the votes of everyone at the end and that's it. All those design elements tend to come together in an assembly with a lot of intention.
So that then leads on to the questions I really want to ask you about, because you know this and I don't. You have a lot of experience with this and I don't, which is how it can work in practice. So to start with, there is the question of, so we can say sortition, but that can mean lots of different things. And we can mean lots of different things by randomness. And it raises the question of representation. That is, in what ways are the people in this assembly, on this jury, meant to stand in for the wider population? There is a pure idea of randomness, which might say, well, just by being citizens. And in a way, it doesn't matter. And that might also feed into a notion that actually there's something almost anonymous about this, that finding out who the other people are shouldn't really be part of the process. It's closer to the Condorcet view, which is just get enough people, aggregate it. Doesn't matter who they are. They can be anonymous ciphers of the truth, and you'll get a better outcome. Citizens' assemblies are not like that. So how important is it within the broad context of randomness actually to engineer a group of people, first of all, who you think can work together, and secondly, who in some sense represent the wider population? How much engineering goes into the randomness?
A fair question and a way of putting it, because as you say, it's not just the pure randomness, but there is a principle in terms of ideally, anybody should have an equal chance of being selected to be part of this in the first place. And then there's a question of, okay, so how do you design a process to enable that? So what tends to happen in practice is that there's a two-stage process. And in a first instance, there's a very large number of invitations that go out completely at random. So say this is in a city, we'll go out to about 10,000 people receiving an invitation in the post. And amongst those 10,000 who receive this, there will be then a proportion of them who accept that invitation and say, yes, I will be part of this process. So amongst that pool of people, there's then a second stage of the sortition process, which technically gets called stratification. So if you're familiar with polling, it's the same kind of process that goes on. It's a process to basically ensure that this final group of people is broadly representative of a population in terms of things like geography, age, education, and other criteria. It's actually a political decision to decide by which criteria do we want this group to be representative of the wider population. And I did say broadly representative, emphasizing that bit, because I think, again, if you're familiar with statistics and polling, and people who are in that world will quickly say like, oh, but with only 30 people, you're not going to have that strictly broadly representative sample. But also you're working with 30 people who are going to be deliberating for a very large period of time with one another as well. So there's other criteria to be taking into account there. So there's two stages that go on to ensure that that final group is random, but as broadly representative as possible, because you do still get some bias in who says yes. There are more people who tend to be a bit more educated or wealthier who might say yes in that initial invitation process, but we also have the data which shows us that it also reaches a ton of people who don't typically participate in other democratic processes, who've never voted, who don't go to town hall meetings, who aren't typically politically active in parties or otherwise. So it is a form of reaching beyond the kind of usual people who have a greater tendency to participate. And the additional benefit is that it actually activates them into more active citizens afterwards.
So that to me provokes two questions. One out of curiosity, which is, what is the uptake? So as you say, it really varies. You might get retired people or people with more educational qualifications between people who've heard of what a citizens' assembly is having a higher uptake. But broadly, and I'm sure it varies from place to place, city to city, you're going to get a different answer depending on where you ask. But it is an interesting question about how willing people are to participate in democracy. And it's quite demanding. As you say, this could be a request to take a chunk of time out of your life. Among that other group, the ones that you would expect to have a lower uptake, what kind of an uptake are we talking about here? Are we talking about 5% or 25% or somewhere outside of that range? If I had to guess, I would say maybe 10%. Am I completely out?
No, you're not too far away. You're not too far away because we do have data on this. Actually, in a previous role that I had at the OECD, put together a database while I was there that has over 700 examples today of citizens' assemblies that have taken place across the world, which has 80 different variables. And so one of those that we did want to look at as well, what is the typical response rate? So you don't have data for every example, especially some of the more historical ones, as a little caveat. But we do know that typically the overall response rate tends to be between 4 to 10%, which might sound low, but actually is way higher than any kind of direct mail response rate or response rates to other kinds of things. But also, I think we need to keep in mind that for many people, this is still a relatively new thing. Some people are still receiving this invitation being like, what is this? Like starting from a point of not necessarily trusting the government as well. And we see that in contexts like, for example, in Ireland, which now has one of the longest traditions, I would say, in Europe of doing these assemblies. That response rate has been going up to about 25%. So I think that my hypothesis is also as citizens' assemblies become more widely known, as we have more examples where people know that, okay, this is worth my time because I know the government is going to do something, that will also have an impact on response rates. We're still really early in the wider historical sense of this democratic innovation.
Does that relatively low response rate, and it's very interesting what you say about Ireland and the way in which it ticks up, but does that relatively low response rate mean there's a kind of prior stratification taking place, which is you're going to end up in a citizens' assembly with people who are not typical of the wider population? Because even if they are people who might not normally engage in certain other things, they have been triggered by this request in the same way that people who end up running for parliament and getting elected are a pretty narrow subset of the population, because most people would hate that job and actually think that people who want to do that are quite weird. And many of them are a little strange, to be honest. I mean, politics as a way of life, as a profession, is becoming an increasingly niche activity. Is there concern among the people who put these assemblies together that you've got a slightly niche subset of the population? You've got the enthusiasts. That may be a good thing or a bad thing, enthusiasm, engagement, but also people who are enthusiasts might have a bee in their bonnet. They might have a particular preoccupation. Is that a concern that, say, 4%? What about the other 96%? Are they unrepresented here?
I don't know if that's the way that I would put it or think about it. And I think that's a fair push on this part of the issue. I mean, it's not a perfect way of choosing a group of people, but I do think it's the best way of trying to choose a group of people who also have a very different set of incentives. So you say they might be the enthusiasts, but actually from the interviews that have been done with assembly members in countries all over the world, so many people responded for various motivations. Many of them really hesitated to even accept it in the first place. In assemblies also, people tend to be paid for their time and other costs and stuff covered. So this is not usually a huge amount. It's usually the equivalent actually of what people get paid for jury duty. But for some people, that in itself was like enough of an initial incentive to say, okay, I'll just do this. And so you do get people who are not necessarily there to fight on an issue or an agenda that they're already campaigning on or otherwise. And actually, in some assemblies where it's been on very high-profile contentious questions, like, for example, on abortion in Ireland, people who were already part of campaigning groups for any side of the issue were excluded from being able to be assembly members, but they could present evidence as stakeholders to the assembly, for instance. So there are various other kind of design measures in place to try and ensure that this doesn't become a group of just the enthusiasts. And I think because of the fact that there aren't any incentives around being re-elected or needing to fulfill any requirements about campaign financing or holding a party line or anything like this. People are actually quite free in terms of their participation within these assemblies, and it's part of the beauty of why they are, I would say, quite democratic processes.
You could say there are two groups of people who are most significantly underrepresented in conventional electoral systems. And I want to know whether either of these two groups feature. So one is people putting together citizens' assemblies. Do they go beyond the electoral register to the people who are not registered to vote? Because in most systems, that is often held up as it can be many millions of people who have no democratic representation, and yet they could easily be included. The other group is people whose age is below the age at which the vote is given. So maybe not young children, but certainly teenagers. Very, I would say, under or even non-represented in electoral systems. Is the net cast wide enough to include more or less the whole population, not just people who are registered to vote, so as to be able to capture people who are left out from conventional electoral systems?
The answer to that first question is yes, as much as possible. There's obviously just limitations depending on the jurisdiction of what kind of data is available. And in places where there is only electoral registration data, efforts are always made to go beyond that in whatever way is possible. And in many other places, like actually where I live now in the Netherlands, also in Belgium and others, there are compulsory requirements for all people resident in that country to be registered with their locality. So that kind of more comprehensive registration data tends to be the basis of this. Actually, there have been campaigns and some legislative moves in certain places to make any kind of more national registration data like that available for people who are doing assembly processes because of GDPR and other beautiful things from the EU level. It's actually quite hard sometimes on a practical level to do this. So even though it seems like a technical question, it's actually one of the biggest challenges because, as you rightly point out, though, how we cast that net at the beginning has a big impact on who can even be part of such an assembly in the first place. And on the second question on young people, actually, you might be pleasantly surprised to learn that it's become more and more common practice that the minimum age is 16 and above. And there's been a growing number of children and young people's assemblies that have been taking place as well, either independently on their own or happening at the same time and in connection to other, I guess you would say, the adult assembly that's taking place. So in Scotland, for example, they had a National Citizens' Assembly on climate, where they also had a children's assembly that took place in parallel and then met and worked together, and their recommendations were combined together at the end. In Ireland, at a national level, there was also a Children and Young People's Assembly on climate and biodiversity loss that took place. And then at a local level, there's been a growing number. I actually just saw right before that there's another one in a Mexican city that has just been announced. So this has become a more, I think, common way. And I'm quite excited to see this development as well, because I think even in let's say, the other parts of our democratic system when it comes to voting, we still have not reached a full franchise. There's still many people who get excluded, so children and young people being some of them, but also immigrants and people who are not necessarily formal citizens but are living in a place. And both of these groups also tend to be more likely to be included within a citizens' assembly as well, and to be able to actually have a voice and influence there.
So let's assume we've gathered together our ideal citizens' assembly, which meets as many of these criteria as possible. How then does it work? And one of the questions I think people often have about citizens' assemblies, which is, what is the balance between the citizens talking about this, arguing among themselves, thrashing it out, and the citizens being given evidence, expert testimony, being guided or even led through the process? Because that's also where you might see a tension between two different notions of what deliberation involves. In your ideal citizens' assembly, where do you strike the balance between the citizens just arguing it out and the citizens being told how to argue it out?
I think this is one of the most crucial parts of actually how you even design the assembly process, because who chooses the information and what stakeholders do people hear from obviously then determines and shapes what kind of conclusions people come to in the first place. And so why don't I answer your question through the lens of one example, and then we can also expand upon the principles. So for instance, in France at the national level, the last citizens' assembly that took place was around the issue of whether France should change its existing legislation on end-of-life issues to do with euthanasia, assisted dying, and other related matters? And if so, how? So they had brought together 185 people selected by sortition, and they brought them together for 27 days of deliberation spread out over 4 months. So during that period of time, they heard from over 60 experts. And I mean experts in a very broad sense of the term. It also included faith group leaders, philosophers, people with lifelong illnesses, doctors, researchers, people who are experts on different aspects of the matter, palliative care as well. And there had been a separate governance committee that was set up independently who was responsible for choosing that group of the 60 experts. The citizens themselves could also request additional expertise if they felt they needed questions answered before being able to move on. And so hearing from all these people, they then deliberated also amongst themselves, and they came up with 167 recommendations for the French government about how the laws should change. They came up with 67 recommendations, and it was in a 176-page report. I was confusing the two figures that they wrote in their own words. And I say these figures because I think it illustrates also how different this is to, sometimes people say, isn't this just like a better focus group? But if you listen to all of the details I say about 185 people, 27 days, 67 recommendations, and their 176-page report, that they voted and had 92% consensus amongst themselves at the end of this process. I think it shows the sort of difference in the weight of a citizens' assembly compared to other kinds of more participatory processes also that people might be familiar with too.
When you say they wrote the report in their own words, is there a selection process within an assembly where certain people are identified for certain roles? I assume they didn't write it as a wiki document where all 185 of them were constantly editing and re-editing each other's words. Do they kind of nominate a scribe, or is there a foreperson or even a leader of the Citizens' Assembly?
This actually depends on the process. Sometimes they're actually working on a bit of a wiki document that they're all editing and working on. To be honest, I don't know the specific details of this process, so I don't want to answer incorrectly on that front.
Because it does also raise that question of the ways in which, once you've got that scale, does it need to parallel something more like a criminal trial, in the sense, do you need between the experts and, let's call them the jury here, people who play the role of advocates? Because I can imagine it is possible to allow all 185 people to question all of the experts, but that it might be more productive if various challenges or points of view were funneled through people who are able to articulate and direct that in the way that would be most productive. Is there an intermediary space between the 185 and, say, the philosopher who comes in to explain to you that life is sacred, which allows for a questioning, or is it really a free-for-all?
It's really a free-for-all in the sense of, I was actually there to observe some of those sessions when some of the experts were there, that all of the assembly members were able to, anyone who had a question was able to raise their hand and ask it. And actually, it reminds me of another point that I think is really worth emphasizing, that amongst these 185 people, 184 of them ended up participating throughout all of it. So there was only one person that, due to, I think, a change of job or something, just was not able to do it. But I was there at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and everyone's there super diligent, taking this seriously. And we also have the data that the dropout rates are really, really low, that people really stay through the entirety of these processes, especially once they get started as well, that this is quite a serious endeavor. And I think precisely the beauty of it being what you call the free-for-all is part of the benefit of the diversity of the people that are in that room, and part of why having the heterogeneous mix leads to better outcomes than having just experts who tend to have more similar reference points already as a starting point to one another than people who are coming at an issue from such a wide variety of life experiences.
So that then raises the question of what kinds of questions or issues are best suited to this. And also, what is the motivation of governments, in this case, the French government, to summon the citizens to deliberate on this question? And again, I think there are a range of views here, and I don't know whether it ranges from the cynical to the ideal or there's some other spectrum, but a more cynical take on this would be there are some questions that governments like to pass off to citizens' assemblies because they are difficult. They might be capable of bogging down the political process in a series of questions which are very contentious and don't really sit well with party divide. So these might be questions that cut across the party divide, through to the ideal version, which is governments increasingly want to know what their citizens actually think and would like to encourage more citizen participation in order to get a better politics. That's I think the version of the argument of citizens' assemblies, which is completely plausible, but I'm unlikely to believe that that's in the heart of the politicians. So if we take that French case, end of life care, the British Parliament has just had a really contentious legislative process culminating in a quite an impressive, quite moving, but also quite curtailed debate in the House of Commons about assisted dying. And it did produce a change in the law, which now then will go to the second chamber, the House of Lords. And that familiar process, and this was elected representatives who stood up and said they spoke for their constituents, which made you think, well, how many of them have you consulted? And actually, are you not speaking about your own personal experience? All of that, but it's the House of Commons. It's a lot of people. Why, in the French case, was that taken out of the legislature and put in the hands of a citizens' assembly? Is it just because it was too hot to handle for the legislature?
I'm not sure it's actually fair to say that it was completely taken out of the hands of the legislature, because actually the legislature still was the one that actually drafted a bill that was on the basis of the recommendations from the Assembly and then voted to approve it. So I wouldn't characterize it as being taken away from the hands of the legislator. I would say that actually the legislator is then being able to take action in a way that is much more informed by informed deliberation by citizens on issues that tend to in fact be of a more contentious nature. So I'm with you in the sense of the former set of arguments being the greater motivators for political officials and wanting to hold assemblies in the first place. They tend to be on issues that are the hot potato kinds of questions where it's really hard for them to take action on. A lot of people sometimes ask the question of, well, isn't a citizens' assembly that takes so many months to organize and then carry out just slowing things down? But actually, on a lot of the issues that they're deliberating on, these have been wider questions of political debate for years without any action being taken because nobody has the courage to just take a decision on it because of fear of electoral consequences or otherwise. And so citizens' assemblies have enabled governments, I think, to be able to have a greater sense of legitimacy to take action on issues that have been really hard to take decisions on. And that was the case with the French on assisted dying as well.
So let me ask the question slightly differently, because of course you're right, citizens' assemblies can't pass laws. When the government or the legislature hands over the question to a citizens' assembly, say in the French case, to what extent did they commit themselves to being bound by any of the outcomes? So was this merely advisory, discretionary, we value your input, this is so nice of you to have done this, we will take what you say very seriously? Or was it a case where they said, the way we show you we value your input is we are pre-committing ourselves before we know what you say to incorporate what you say into our legislation?
The former. It was advisory, taken seriously, I think because of the fact that it also had a huge amount of media coverage in France. I was living there at the time when it was taking place as well. I think that was part of also what, let's say, put an additional layer of pressure on the government to take this quite seriously. But in terms of what made it into the final bill, the vast majority of those recommendations are in there. So there has been a direct follow-up to what citizens have come up with. And as I said, it was a really serious piece of work in terms of the level of evidence and the reasoning that they also laid out behind the recommendations that they put in there.
And was it surprising to people that, I think you said 92% consensus on these recommendations? So in a parliament, you almost never get 92% because parties divide. And even if you get votes across party lines, people would almost be suspicious that that result had been fixed. Is this thought to be a good example of the ways in which extended deliberation over a period of time, hearing from experts, far from cementing people's prior views, actually allows them to change them in the direction of consensus? The ideal version of deliberation is deliberation towards consensus. This seems like an example of that actually happening in practice.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, the threshold for recommendations to be adopted by a group tends to be somewhere between 75 to 80% of the assembly members needing to agree for it to become a recommendation. So 92% is also particularly high when they were voting on the overall grouping of all their recommendations at the very end. But I think there's two things that are interesting here. One is that it was very closely aligned with wider public opinion on the more general, wider issue. But I think it's also hard to get a sense because, again, 176 pages, there's a huge amount of nuance. It's not about a yes or no answer to a question that's in there either, right? But I think one of the most moving things that stayed with me after that assembly process happened was listening to an interview on primetime 8 p.m. talk show TV with a few of the assembly members that were being interviewed afterwards. And one of the women who was part of this assembly at the very outset, for religious reasons, she was very against any form of changes to liberalize assisted dying legislation. And at the end of the process, on a very personal level, her views for religious reasons were the same, but she was explaining why she voted in favor of changing the legislation because of this process, because of the fact that she felt respected, heard, listened to, understood, and that also she came to understand in greater depth also all of the views and arguments of other people who had different views on it, and because of the fact that other things that were really dear to her heart to do with palliative care and aspects to that were also part of this bill. So there was that more holistic sense of what is this change that we are voting on. So I think that also shows part of the beauty that it's not always just about people changing their minds. People can actually still have the same fundamental view, but have a much deeper understanding of themselves, but also that sense of feeling heard and respected and recognized as part of this also, I think, really matters.
Claudia, as you mentioned, and I think a lot of people might associate citizens' assemblies with this, they are often used around questions of climate change. So that could either be quite specific things in local areas to do with land use, energy production, a change in the way that an area is going to get or pay for its energy, right the way through to broader national discussions about strategy in relation to climate change. And I have a couple of questions there. One is there evidence that on those big questions of climate change, about which we're meant to believe people are either divided or very unsure what to do, you do see equivalent levels of consensus emerge? Maybe not 92%, but the threshold is reached in citizens' assemblies that quite specific actions can be suggested by a diverse group of citizens?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of evidence on this actually, because so I mentioned earlier this OECD database that has over 700 examples. The largest proportion of those are on climate related issues that have been addressed. And there's also an organization called the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies that has been doing even deeper research into climate assemblies in particular, which has shown us that people are able to reach those high levels of 75, 80% consensus on these issues. And I think it's because, well, climate is also such a big, broad thing when we just talk about it like that. But as you were even saying in some of your examples, as soon as you start to break it down into things that become more tangible, they still remain complex, but at least people can start to put their fingers around, like, what does this issue actually mean? And I think having the time and space to go into the complexity of understanding some of the technical aspects of it to do with, I don't know, energy transition, for example. One thing is you can ask and do a wider public opinion poll on some of those issues, but it's so complex. You ask me what I think about the energy transition, and I don't know off the top of my head. I have some general broad views, but here what you're getting people to do is actually to hear from a wide group of people, diverse perspectives on the issue, and then figure out also in relation to their values about what kind of society do they want to be living in, coming to some form of consensus about it. And I think that's why they're so valuable, actually, because what comes to mind is a quote that I really like by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, which I don't know the exact wording of it by heart, but the thrust of it is really that the science will be able to tell us, if we do this, X will happen. But it can't answer the question of, do we want that to happen? And I think citizens' assemblies are bringing together both sides of that. There is an exploration of the science, the technical evidence, the expertise, but at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, well, what do we want? There's different trade-offs involved in all of these decisions that are taking place. And I think by having to do that hard work of finding consensus, that's actually what's really valuable about these processes as well. It's much easier to just try and aggregate individual people's preferences. It's much harder to get them to say, okay, what are we actually willing to agree on in terms of the trade-offs here?
And it's also harder for politicians. So the other question is whether climate and questions around climate seem particularly amenable to citizens' assemblies, because it's the prime example of a question that there is a lot of incentive for politicians to kick it down the road. The time horizons are such, the complexity is such, the contentiousness and the role of pressure groups and other kinds of lobbying pushing politicians against some of the harder choices, that it does feel like the sort of question where getting a citizens' assembly together and getting the experts and the citizens in the room is a way of breaking the logjam. Climate feels like a logjam issue. The way we've set up our electoral politics, elections, representation, parties, money, influence, media, all of that nexus, with climate, sometimes I feel we almost designed the system that was perfectly calibrated not to be able to deal with the problem. And so for me, I get citizens' assemblies as having a particular pull here, maybe even more on this than on those moral questions. I see why it might be appealing for those moral conscience questions to have a citizens' assembly, because it kind of cuts against that idea that parliamentary representatives are somehow better than us, their consciences count more than ours do, that they're particularly moral people, because they're not. But on this, it does feel like the thing that could break the logjam.
Yeah, I definitely think so too, because it is complex. And as you say, the time horizons are such that, although it depends on how you're also looking at the issue, I think when people feel climate in their everyday lives, depending on where they are, either they're experiencing more flooding or more fires, or there's other direct impacts on their lives that also need not just how do we deal with this if it happens, but how are we more preventative actually in this in the future. And I think people are actually less divided when you start to ask the questions, even in that kind of way. Who wants to live in a place that has just more and more floods and we're doing nothing about it every year? So I think there's just like a lived reality along with this that citizens have a pragmatism around, that when it gets a bit lost in this higher order, just bigger debate about climate, as though that's just one thing we can decide on in that way as well.
That then leads me to want to ask you about a word that you touched on earlier. And it's the sort of word that I think puts people off a bit because it sounds like I don't know, an academic term or a technical term, but it's about legitimacy and the legitimacy claims here, because I think in any system that starts to widely adopt citizens' assemblies, and I think I'm right that they are being more and more widely adopted by, as you say, we're very early in this process, and it's not like we're living in a world where there are citizens' assemblies everywhere, but the numbers and the use and the range of use is going up. As citizens' assemblies do more work and perhaps come up with conclusions that push against some of the political consensus or even just some of the vested interests in the legislature, there will be a kind of legitimacy competition. So it's easy when the Citizens' Assembly does something that the politicians want to do anyway, and it gives them cover or it gives them an impetus to do it. But when they are at odds, there are going to be rival claims to legitimacy, and politicians will always be able to say, but we got elected. So the example I'm thinking of here is Brexit, actually. So I think people in Britain, probably some people would only really have first have heard of this at the time that the Brexit logjam happened. And after the referendum, Brexit got completely stuck in the UK Parliament. The Parliament showed itself unable to deal with the question until a general election was called that would turn out to solve it. But it looked hard even to get to an election because Parliament couldn't agree on an election. It took 3 years to get there. In those 3 years, more and more people, including in Parliament, started to push for a citizens' assembly to break the logjam. And one of the arguments that was made was that the problem with the referendum is it didn't ask people what kind of Brexit they wanted. And that's a complicated question with many variables. It's not a yes-no question. And a citizens' assembly is very well designed, calibrated to tease out those differences, to explore that. It could be genuinely representative, including all those people who voted in the referendum who didn't normally vote in general elections. But the big barrier in the way was whatever a citizens' assembly came up with on Brexit, there would be too many people who say, yeah, but it's not a referendum, is it? The referendum just has a punch, a legitimacy punch. And then the elected representatives in Parliament would also say, who elected these people? Whatever answer the Citizens' Assembly came up with, my feeling always was it would never, ever win a legitimacy contest with electoral politics or direct participatory politics, that is, a referendum. Do you see that changing anytime soon? Brexit is a particular example. But if we think of this as a contest for legitimacy, do you think the claims of Citizens' Assembly could actually push back against, rival the claims of the electoral system? Or is that always going to be a pipe dream?
Well, I think there's a few dimensions to that question, actually. And I think Brexit is a really good example, though, to start from, because I think you could also compare it to another parallel of a contentious issue that had a yes-no framing, but also was not just a yes-no question, where a couple of years earlier in Ireland, they had a citizens' assembly actually around various constitutional issues, but that included, I'll take one example, the constitutional issue around same-sex marriage, which it was at the time in the constitution that this was something that was not legal in Ireland. Well, same-sex marriage, but also abortion were two of the ones that were on the table. I think abortion was the more contentious one. And again, some people see this as a yes or no issue, but actually they had a citizens' assembly that deliberated for 5 months, that heard from also stakeholders and activist groups on different sides of that issue. And then they recommended that there should be a referendum in Ireland to change the constitution, because that's necessary to be able to change it there. But it wasn't just that simple recommendation. It was actually accompanied by a much more detailed set of recommendations for how the accompanying legislation should change should the Irish people vote for a constitutional amendment. And so that then went through a parliamentary committee that actually translated that into a legal text. And so when people in Ireland went to vote in that referendum on should we change the constitution regarding abortion, they knew what kind of change that would entail. And the polling showed that around 2/3 of people were aware of the fact that a citizens' assembly was also behind the work to draft that piece of legislation around it. So I think you could have imagined an alternative scenario where there was a citizens' assembly that laid out the contours of what kind of Brexit would we want, and that could be the guiding light for British politicians in negotiations with the EU. Though, of course, it's a different context because it wasn't just up to the British government what Brexit would entail. It was a negotiating process. So I don't know. I think it's a very difficult kind of question that was just bound to result in people being divided on it the way it ended up being framed in the UK. But just to say that I think you can be combining assemblies with referendums to have a different sense of legitimacy behind a decision too.
That was the point I wanted to make, that the two examples, and they were discussed at the time, I remember in the Brexit context, people said, look, it really worked in Ireland. It seems to me the obvious difference and the lesson to draw is about sequencing. To have the Citizens' Assembly after a referendum, which has produced a result that Parliament can't deal with, is never going to work because the referendum has set the context. And there, I think the legitimacy contest would be lost. The Brexit referendum would have been a much, much better political process. Would it have produced the same outcome, different outcome? I don't know. I don't care in this context. It would have been a much better process if it had been preceded by a citizens' assembly. So once the British Parliament decided this question was so important that it would have to go to the people, a citizens' assembly could have sat, come up with, for instance, recommendations about the question on the ballot paper, come up with recommendations about the kind of information they wanted from both sides, come up with recommendations about the range of options that they felt should be made available to the public before they made that choice. And it feels to me like the obvious difference between the two cases is citizens' assembly leading up to a referendum, good outcome. Referendum, and then people who didn't like the result saying, I wish we could have a citizens' assembly to sort this out. Never, ever going to work.
Yeah, I think that's not going to work for numerous reasons. But I also don't want to lose sight of another aspect of your question. I mean, I don't really want to go down too far the legitimacy rabbit hole because I do think that's something that academics care a lot more about than a wider public. I don't know how many people you hear talking about legitimacy at the pub, but I don't really hear that come up very often.
To be honest, even academics don't talk about it at the pub.
Yeah, maybe not. So perhaps they just leave it in the papers. But I do think there is this question of, well, who does a wider public trust? And if there is a contention between different outcomes, I think one of the interesting things actually also on climate was the French National Assembly, Citizens Assembly, that took place on this issue back in 2019, 2020, that led to about 150 recommendations. Lots of controversy around it at the time because many of them were not accepted or watered down in some way. And there was a polling that was done at the time which showed that around 85% of people in France wanted the government to accept those recommendations in a binding way, and that they would want more citizens' assemblies of a binding nature on government. And so even though there was the lack of the ministers who contested the citizens' assemblies recommendations that they didn't want to accept, made claims about their own legitimacy, etc. But actually, when you look at what the wider public thinks about such a process, what we see in many different contexts is that actually people tend to trust their fellow citizens, and they trust a process that involves people like them being part of it, and that there is growing demand for people to actually have greater power in these assemblies. And so part of the questions that interest me the most today are about how can we be institutionalizing these citizens' assemblies, ensuring that they actually have a legal basis so that they're not just dependent on political will in one moment in time, but actually become a more normalized part of the system that has a legal basis, that therefore also has a relationship with elected officials, with the public administration. It's not about replacing elections, but it is about creating maybe a third deliberative pillar that has power. And we see that this is happening in more and more places, starting to transform the relationship between citizens and government.
When I think about the British context, I see how this could almost be a chicken and egg problem in that it seems to me the question of when and how citizens' assemblies should be used in the British political system is an excellent question to put to a citizens' assembly. I think that would be the perfect forum in which to thrash that out. I don't think actually the political system we have is very good at reforming itself, knowing where and how it can be supplemented in different ways. But you would need an initial impetus, and I think it could be. So the trouble with Brexit is it was a crisis. Crises aren't good ways actually to do constitutional reform, but a broader constitutional convention, actually, which is not a million miles from a citizen assembly. If, say, at some point in the future, Britain convened a constitutional convention to think about constitutional reform, that's one way these two things could intersect. I want to ask you one last question, which goes back to where we started, which isn't just about citizens' assemblies, but we started with the principle of sortition. And I said there are people who think it should be more widely used and applied. Are you one of those people? Do you think that outside of the citizens' assembly process, which is quite specific and it has a big literature around it telling us how to do it, but it's also in a way in a particular box, that picking people at random or effectively at random for roles in the political process is something we should just generally be more open to? It is the ancient idea. It's what the Athenians meant by democracy. That's literally what they meant by it. It was politics by random selection, and everything else was secondary. For us, it feels like a completely fringe idea. But do you think there are ways in which we should just be more open to it beyond citizens' assemblies?
I think definitely. And I think even beyond the political system, because I think we've also taken part of this notion of democracy as elections and have brought that into other forms of our daily life and into other organizations as means of choosing different positions and so on. And so some of the other work that I'm doing actually is outside the bounds of government, working also with institutions like museums and universities and cooperatives who are interested in changing their forms of governance and decision making to incorporate more of these principles, not just of sortition, but usually sortition together with deliberation and rotation, like we had talked about earlier as well, to start to shift how they're taking decisions on a more ongoing way. And I think that's almost just as, if not more, exciting to me than seeing everything that's going on in the space of cities and other governments that are taking up citizens' assemblies as a form of representation and decision making. Because if we want to move to a more democratic society, I think we need to actually see some of these broader shifts also in other organizations that we're part of and that are part of our lives.
Are you finding any of these organizations open to the idea of sortition, selection by random principles for leadership positions, as well as merely for deliberation and consultation? The really radical idea is the idea that even leadership itself has become, it's sort of ossified around certain criteria, and there's increasing frustration and lack of trust in systems of leadership, and that we should be more open to thinking that leadership is a position that could be allocated not quite to anyone, but to a much broader range of people than the kind of people who usually end up on top. When you say that to a university or a museum or even a cooperative, are people open to that yet, or is that a step too far?
Yeah, I would say probably not quite. I think there's also a broader discussion about that, though, because I think, again, I'm not sure this is a total replacement to the need for leadership, which has other qualities and experience and expertise around it. Like, I still think we need those things, but it's more about what is the combination with sortition based on other democratic practices and what is the balance of power between them and how does that perhaps shift over time. I think I still would also really like to see more binding authority in the decisions that are taken by these assemblies, because you asked earlier about, are these examples usually consultative, or are they actually, do they have a weight behind them? And typically they are just consultative. And of course, this raises other questions around legitimacy, accountability, and all of those sorts of things that then go along with it. But I don't think those are unanswerable questions. And I think perhaps especially at a local council level with folks who are particularly ambitious and innovative to try something new, and maybe it'll come out of a crisis as some of these things do as well. I think that would be really a next step of some of the things that we have not yet seen, but I could foresee in the future too.
So presidents and prime ministers chosen by lot, we're not quite there yet outside of science fiction. Not quite.
Not quite, but also not unimaginable. We've had so many different systems over the centuries, right? So it's part of what we've been talking about.
And so for me, this is the key part of all of this. I think the biggest problem that we have is when people talk about democracy, they mean the democracy that we've had for the last 100 years, and they think that that is the absolutely universal default. And it's historically contingent. It's probably moved quite a long way through its life cycle, is my guess, and it's coming towards the end of its life. And then people think, oh my God, that means we're about to head back to a world of autocracy and fascism. No, it should mean we're about to head to a world of different kinds of democracy. A reminder that if you would like to hear the second part of my conversation with Hannah White, it's available now on PPF Plus. In it, we talk about not just how to make Parliament work better, but how to make politics work better. Why do politicians keep making such bad decisions? To get that and all of our bonus episodes, past, present, and future, all you have to do is click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and you can find out how. Also, we wanted to remind you that the second film in our film season is coming up at the Regent Street Cinema in London. It's a screening of an amazing film, My Dinner with Andre, and we have a really interesting guest, Lee Hall, who, among many, many other things, is the creator of Billy Elliot. If you'd like to come to that, tickets are still available. Again, just click on the link in the show description or go to the events page on our website, ppfideas.com. A lot of people have been writing in to ask us if these live episodes are going to be coming out on PPF. We are very aware not everyone can get to London. Not everyone can get to the UK. Yes, we will be putting all of them out, not straight away, but you will be able to hear all of our live episodes on PPF before too long. Next time, in Fixing Democracy, something a little bit different, I'm going to be talking to the political scientist Nick Cheeseman about election rigging, how governments rig elections and how to stop it. What makes an election free and fair? That's next time. This has been past, present, future.